If we in any way want to do better or do history better, we have to be courageous.
That's why it's essential that we acknowledge the people upon whose backs this country was founded.
The more people understand someone else's perspective, the more likely they are to listen.
We're going to make a better future for ourselves. We need to.
I hope that in 30 or 40 years that conversations like this will not be necessary. I hope in 30 or 40 years we will look at each other and see each other as Americans.
I think that once people really know the history, I think then people will begin to have respect for one another.
This is not just Black history. This is America's story.
On the fall line of the James River sits Virginia's capital city. The culture of Richmond is vibrant, and its story is one as changing as the flow of the waters here. Along the river also sits a new reminder of some of that story that's finally being told.
I always think about, in Hamilton, the lyric, "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?" And if you're not telling your story, not only are you not in the history, but the impact that you and your story had on your community and generations to come isn't told. And so that's the real importance of all of this, is telling a story that for over a century wasn't told.
On Browns Island, one of Richmond's most popular parks, is the city's newest monument, Emancipation and Freedom. The statue, like the history it's hoping to convey, is a long time coming. I met up with State Senator Jennifer McClellan at the park. She chairs the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Commission for the Commonwealth, which made the statue possible. Senator McClellan says the conversation to build this started in 2011.
When we saw the model for this, it captured exactly what we were looking for. And I loved the idea of we're capturing the emotion and the importance of emancipation, but we're also capturing the movement with the people represented on the base. So we selected the design, we selected this spot because of its connection to Black history. The first African-American church, founded after the Civil War, was founded in an old Confederate horse barn here. We went through public hearings to select the people who would be on it, and then we went out and raised the money, and here it is.
The statue was unveiled in September of 2021, but was originally supposed to be unveiled for the 400th commemoration of 1619, the year the first enslaved Africans were brought to English North America at present-day Hampton. McClellan says the commission held public hearings around the state, asking residents what they wanted to see in the statue, and this is the result. Resilience and healing, but also a reminder of how brutal slavery was. This is here to tell that complex story in hopes of gaining understanding to move forward.
We as a Commonwealth, as a country, as a people, suffered a family trauma. And slavery was trauma for Black Virginians, Black Americans, but like any family, you can't heal from that trauma unless you talk about it. You talk about how it impacted everyone in the family, and begin to move forward. But the past impacts the present. All of us, especially public policymakers, our views and the policy we make are shaped by our history and our perspective. And the perspective of Black Americans and Black Virginians has not always been told.
But just a few miles away from Browns Island are other statues that are causing monumental change in the city. The statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee once stood here for over 100 years and was joined along the street by other statues of Confederate figures.
I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and in learning about Richmond, I learned two things, that it was the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War, and that there was an avenue full of monuments. So as an outsider, that was what I knew.
And for Christina Vita at the Valentine Museum, she says they're working to help the public understand why those statues were put here in the early 1900s.
I think we can help Virginians understand the complexity of our own history and how you can see things from multiple perspectives. I think you can take one object or one document or one photograph and really unpack it. I think we can also start to talk about the complicity of some of our Commonwealth institutions and how we've characterized history over the past. We talk about the legacies of Jim Crow, and much of that is actually played out in our textbooks and how students are taught history. And the history of history gets to be complex and some people's brains start to spin. But when you think about how we're teaching history, whether it's in museums or in classrooms.
The Valentine is Richmond's oldest serving history institution, having opened in 1898 at the request of man S. Valentine at his death. Valentine's wealth through the creation of Valentine's meat juice allowed him to collect artifacts and art that he left behind for the museum. Valentine's brother Edward was its first president and a sculptor.
We are standing inside the Edward Valentine Sculpture Studio. It was an 1830s carriage house that he converted into his personal sculpture studio in 1871, and he crafted lost cause artworks here until he tailored off his sculpture career in the early 1900s.
Edward Valentine was one of the most well-known sculptors in the South. During the Civil War, Vita says Valentine was in Germany studying before returning to Virginia.
Valentine's career is really jump-started by the Civil War. He actually spends the entirety of the Civil War in Germany studying sculpture there. He comes back in 1865 at the end of the war after his father's passed away, and he starts his career on creating works that help mythologize the spirit of the Confederacy. That continues to grow throughout the 1860s and into the 1870s, and he's crafting artworks that support the lost cause mythology, the idea that life before the Civil War was that much better, that slavery was good for Black Virginians, that the Reconstruction period was the worst part of the war, and that it really drove Black Virginians to not be able to take care of themselves.
Vita says much of his work went to private homes for personal use, but
he's also crafting monumental sculptures. Things like the recumbent Lee, that's still a marble sculpture in place at Washington and Lee over Robert E. Lee's tomb. He crafts in 1907 a monumental sculpture of Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy. That's unveiled on Monument Avenue in 1907. This is only a few years after the 1902 Constitution has passed, basically not allowing 90% of Black male Virginians to vote, along with about 50% of white male Virginians. So you're looking at these sculptures being crafted and put in these very visible public places at the same time that public policies are again reasserting racial oppression and control over Black Virginians.
Valentine Studio is currently closed as the museum thinks about what's next for the space. But Vita says they focus on telling all of Richmond's history from the days Native Americans called it home to the present. And now they're working to gain trust in the community.
I think the Valentine has a really special role to play in acknowledging that our institution was one of those that promoted white supremacy throughout its history from the 1890s onwards. And of course there were other institutions doing the same as well. And so we want to be a trusted institution. We want to be forthcoming about that. And until we are open and having those types of discussions about our historic roles as institutions, it's going to be hard for folks that haven't been here to maybe trust us.
And that's by highlighting and showcasing the other voices Richmond offered during the time the monuments went up.
There were other voices speaking out proactively against lost cause public art, whether that's John Mitchell Jr. through his publications in the Richmond Planet, Maggie Walker and her activism for making sure that Black women could vote as soon as the 19th Amendment was passed. There's also just so many other voices throughout the 20th century that we want to make sure are being amplified. Just because a piece of artwork has been staring down over our city for a long time doesn't mean that that's the only story about it that there is to tell.
The Valentine is also continuing to tell the stories of the Confederate monuments through their walking tours. Debuted in 2021 in collaboration with Art Glass, the tour allows visitors to don augmented reality headsets, showing historic images and primary resources from their collections.
As you're walking around Monument Avenue and Arthur Ashe Boulevard, you're able to see what it looked like in the 1890s or the early 1900s. And then once you flip up your visor and you're with your small group on your tour, we're having really in-depth discussions about how you learned about history growing up. What sorts of terms did you use to describe the Civil War? What did your textbook read like when you were in grade school growing up? And having those small group conversations, you know, in an age where so much of our social media discussions are siloed and we're not hearing much from the other side, these small group walking tours with the augmented reality smart glasses from Art Glass have allowed us to overlay our current discussions with history in place, right? We're getting to have these conversations on Monument Avenue. And I think it's hugely important the role that the Valentine Museum is playing in having these conversations, opening up dialogue and allowing people to really talk to each other and not just type into their phones.
It's those conversations of education and understanding Senator McClellan also hopes we can come by through having statues like Emancipation and Freedom exist.
The more people understand someone else's perspective, the more likely they are to listen. And I think part of the problem is too many of these conversations are like shouting matches over social media behind a computer. They need to be in person. They need to be in small groups. They need to be through dialogues. And public art can help you do that. Community conversations can help you do that.
Since meeting with McClellan and Vida, the Robert E. Lee statue's base in Richmond's come down. The statue will go to the Black History Museum and Culture Center of Virginia, where the Valentine will help with community conversations to get input on what's next.
Monuments are not actually history. Monuments is art that's telling and conveying memory. So if you think about monuments as memory, our memories are always changing. They're always tweaking a little bit as we age and grow older. I know mine's certainly going out the window when I'm standing in the grocery store. Each generation gets to tell a new story, gets to craft a new memory for future generations.
And the newest one here on Browns Island is a chance to work toward that healing. Just 2 weeks after the Lee statue was removed, Emancipation and Freedom got its debut.
It's sort of the symbolism of hope and moving forward and redemption and beginning to heal, coming out of trauma and hatred and propaganda around the lost cause of the Civil War, which is very symbolic of what was happening during and in the aftermath of Reconstruction. And so I think we couldn't have planned it any better.
It's a chance at another chapter of Richmond's history, one that hopes to encourage and inspire the next generation toward reconciliation.